Welcome to the Signal Drop, where we discuss all things telecoms. Whether you're a newbie, a nerd, or anything in between, this podcast is for you.
So over the course of this podcast, you'll hear from the Mpirical trainers imparting their knowledge, you'll hear from the Mpirical team, and from time to time, we'll even bring in the odd guest speaker. Hello everyone, and welcome to about take 100 of the fourth Mpirical podcast. Take 100 because we've got a special guest in the studio today, Rosie, who keeps laughing every time we try to introduce her. So we'll start with you first to get out of the way, Rosie. Hello.
Thanks. Hello, Gavin. Thank you. Thank you.
Rosie is our Learning Engagement Manager, and we've also got Morgan.
Hi.
Our usual special guest. And our not so special guest, just one of the trainers we've dragged in, is also Phil.
Hi, Gavin.
Oh. Full of enthusiasm. Okay, so this is episode 4. We're not too sure of the direction this will take because Morgan and Rosie have been chatting and they have got some themes that they want to discuss.
Been scheming.
Yes, indeed. And I'm going to just hand over to Morgan and let's just see where we go with this.
Okay. Rosie,
Yes.
we are taking this podcast today.
Yeah, we are, because it's about holidays. It's nearly holiday season, and it's a problem I've got at the moment. I haven't booked my holiday. And we were talking in the office before all about connections and roaming and the difficulties in going to different countries and not knowing what's going to happen to your phone.
And getting charged a fortune.
And getting charged a fortune.
Yeah.
And this is what we need to figure out. And I know there's tons of people out there who have the same problem. So help us, please.
Yes. It's expensive. And I know ever since, because I'm, in case anybody hasn't listened before, I'm American. I don't sound it, but I am. And I do try to go back to the States at least once a year. And whenever I do, I know, because I've had to do this for the last 10, 15 years of travel, I switch off the mobile data roaming because I don't want to be charged a fortune. But I don't actually know why I do that, because I know that over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, things have probably evolved. I don't know if it is still as extortionate as it was, but I don't want to take the risk. I could probably check my phone contract, but that just takes too much effort. But I also know that there's a difference between, obviously traveling to the States versus going somewhere in Europe. So yeah, if you could cover the cost, why we need to do it, and what actually happens if our phone does need to roam free, as it sometimes might need to.
Just in terms of the cost, I mean, Phil and I are from the technical side of things, but I can assure you, having travelled fairly recently, that the cost is very much still there. And I guess because the UK in particular have just left the European Union, it's got worse for us in the UK for when we travel abroad to Europe. So the cost is definitely still there. Why it's so expensive? It's quite an interesting question, and it's really down to the wholesale roaming agreements that get put in place between your home operator and the visited network that you visit, and that the price that gets paid. You get charged for things like text messages and voice minutes and megabytes worth of data. And that price can fluctuate. So sometimes you might go abroad and provider X might be the best provider because they're offering the best roaming rates for your home network. And then other times it could be provider Y. But we know that those rates can be very, very high. And from a technical perspective, sometimes when you're just sending a small piece of data like a text message, it's quite hard to fathom out why it is so expensive. But
how does my phone choose which network to go on? So if I go to France and it'll give me, I don't know, different Orange or something, it'll give me different providers. How does it know which one to choose?
How technical do you want to be on this?
Very,
you
of course.
You take this one.
Okay, I'll do two things. One, I'll just go back to the cost just quickly, and just to say that depending on your package, a lot of service providers around the world will offer a baseline package which will give you the minutes of use within the country, but they'll also offer you sort of an uplift that might say, okay, you're allowed to roam to these 51 different countries and you can use your minutes. So you might be finding that you're actually on a package where the same minutes and data that you've got in your home network is available whilst roaming at no extra charge. So don't just assume it's going to cost a lot of money.
And don't book a cruise that goes to 52 countries as opposed to 51. But
yeah, and actually going back to cruises, you've got to be very careful because sometimes as you leave the sort of, say, a mile off land, you're then in international water. And then at that point, you might be finding you're on a cellular network, which is actually linked to a satellite system, and that might treble or quadruple the charge. So, yeah, cruises are always a risky one with respect to charging as well. But going back to the second question, which was, how do you know which network to go on? Again, there is a technical answer, which would probably take more than we've got for a podcast. But what I would say is, as part of the roaming agreements, the device will be switching on in country, this visited network as it's called, and it's going to be doing some scanning, and it's going to find different operators. Now, there's various options in terms of trying to steer your device onto a particular operator, like the preferred roaming environment. So you might find you find one network, you say, hi, I'm roaming, can I go on that network? And that one might, or you should say your home network might say, well, actually, no, you can't. You have to look for another one. And you might find another one which...
And that can be to do with roaming rates, can't it,
at that point?
Time? Yeah.
Do we have any choice in that then? It's just our phone takes over and that's it?
Your phone takes over. Usually on your phone, if you go into the settings, there's sometimes the ability to do what's called a manual selection. So your phone might automatically always go to the preferred option, but you are allowed on the other one, but your phone will automatically go. So in theory, if you had the manual settings configured, you could say, well, actually, I want to go to this one. But you've got to be wary. It might not be the best in terms of cost. It might give you the better connection, but it might not give you the best cost. So it's always a little bit risky going into the manual settings. It's also very risky when you come back to the UK, let's say, where we're based, your phone's still looking for that manually selected network and you get no service. So a lot of people find that they've been messing with the phone and it's not back on the network. So the best thing to do is just let it do its own thing usually. The operator is probably doing it for the purpose of roaming charges and service level agreements.
I'm confused now. So you were talking about cost, Phil. I know the provider sets the cost, but how often does it fluctuate, and why does it fluctuate, I guess? And would there not always be one provider that was able to provide the best cost all the time?
I think the cost you'll find doesn't fluctuate that much. Typically, as part of your roaming agreement, when you go roaming, it'll have a figure that you'll be able to look up online. It'll say, yeah, if you go to that country X, it's going to cost you this much per minute to make calls, do text messages.
I understand.
And that's what you're going to get.
It's more the wholesale roaming costs
I
that
see.
get charged between different operators that they can fluctuate.
I see. Okay. Thank you for that.
It can be nerve-wracking though, can't it? I was in Ireland, sat on the beach, just on my phone, and then I got a phone call and it connected to a different one, like near Dublin. It connected to a completely different provider, and I got charged a fortune for it. So
And you thought you were still on your home network?
I did, yeah.
No.
I was just sat on the beach. Oh.
Yeah, I think you've just got to be careful. And unfortunately, when you look at your phone, especially with the new smartphones, you don't sort of obviously know which network you're on. Some of the sort of the signals are there. It says I'm on 4G, I'm on 5G, but it doesn't always tell you the operator in some cases that you're roaming onto, which again, in the olden days, the old phones, the more feature phones with all the big buttons on them, they used to obviously say, oh, you're on this network. And that's obviously, they were priding themselves on telling you that.
And Phil, you were talking a minute ago too about if you go on a cruise. Well, actually, Gavin mentioned going on a cruise. You would know a lot about that because isn't that part of your background, being on the sea?
Don't get him started.
I want to. That's why I did.
Cabaret.
Yeah, it was cabaret, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't the cabaret, unfortunately. It originally was on the QE2 and doing radio. And yeah, we used to charge people a fortune to use the satellite system. I think it was something like $9 a minute at the time. And we're going back many, many years. So, yeah, you didn't want to
How
use...
many years, Phil? How many?
Lots.
Was it?
Yeah, lots.
So you'll be an expert on this then. So we're talking charging for satellite. What about the future? I know we've got a lot of talk in the news right now about these non-terrestrial networks and potentially connecting to satellite networks. Where are we with that? Is that realistically a viable option in the immediate future?
Yeah, there's different options actually, because as there's lots of trials going on. I will point out there's NTN, non-terrestrial networks, which is about this will probably be a new phone, as in not your existing Android or Samsung handset. It'll be a new phone which will have the capability to communicate with these satellite systems. So they're coming. There is also the ability to take your existing phone and communicate to satellite systems as well. But that's not really NTN, that's sort of proprietary-based solutions. There's different options there as well. But yeah, when I say NTN, non-terrestrial networks, it's not just satellites. It's high-altitude balloons, it's aircraft, it's drones. All of those are under this umbrella of non-terrestrial. So yeah, it might be talking to a satellite at different orbits. It could be using NTN in an emergency disaster recovery scenario. So your phone will be talking to a drone, which then relays it back into the network.
It's not as if the use of satellites is new to cellular networks. They are used, particularly in remote areas where you need to kind of backhaul traffic from a cell site, a base station, back into the network. So satellites can be used, but they've naturally got their limitations.
Obviously, the biggest limitation is the weak power from your phone. You know, if you imagine you're talking to a cell site, which is only typically hundreds of meters through to kilometers away from you. When you start talking about satellite systems, the ones like your satellite TV systems, you know, they're 35,000 kilometers away. They're called geostationary orbits, geosynchronous orbits. So typically now the emphasis is on sort of low Earth and medium Earth orbits, and that's linking to the likes of Starlink and people like that, providing broadband services. And again, they could be delivered to a device, but that's not NTN. NTN is a 3GPP standard, which means you need a 3GPP phone, as in a mobile phone, typically linked into 5G, facilitating that.
I think we did have a question come in, and it was from one of our earlier podcasts related to this area. Was it on our YouTube channel, Morgan?
Yeah, it was.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan, but it related to whether or not the deployment of kind of low Earth orbit satellites is actually going to negate the requirement for the traditional terrestrial network. Now, it wasn't put in those exact words, but that was the kind of gist of it. Are we going to see the decline of terrestrial radio access networks? Instead, we'll see Starlink and other such options being made available. What's your thoughts, Phil?
The answer is no. At the end of the day, these satellite systems and broadband systems like Starlink and things like that, they provide a level of service. You'll have a terminal, you'll get a certain speed, but those speeds are typically nowhere near what potentially you can do on a terrestrial network, because at the end of the day, we're still limited to lots of people on the ground talking to this one satellite. Yes, there's hundreds of satellites, but the footprint for those satellites is huge compared to the size of a cell on a terrestrial network on the ground, effectively. So in terms of the sort of pure performance, you're never going to beat the ability to have a higher data rate in a terrestrial network. Now, you could say, oh, yes, we could design a satellite system that gives us a really high data rate for that one user, but it's then replicating it for lots of users, and it's all about density. And therefore, that's why we've got things like small cells coming in, and lots of small cells in cities and dense urban areas, because you can have a limited number of users connected to that small cell, and therefore it's like sharing a slice of cake. We all like a bigger piece of cake.
Oh, yes.
But the idea is, if you think about a satellite system, the idea is you've got lots more people sharing that cake, and therefore you get a smaller slice.
Okay, I've got a question relating back to travel again.
Not to cake.
No, not yet. A gâteau, if we're in France or something. When you're out and about and your battery's going down quicker because you're travelling around, you haven't got as many kind of charging ports. Does it make a difference to your phone of where it gets, whether it's satellite, which provider it's from, or what drains your battery more?
Okay, what drains your battery more is activity. So generally, your battery life will be getting drained by you making calls. So if you make lots of calls, it's the transmission of information that causes the drain. So that's one thing that mainly causes that. So generally, that won't influence which network you're on, typically. At the end of the day, your phone will still be always camping on the best technology based on the signal it hears. And hopefully that's the one that's hopefully not going to drain your battery as much. So yeah, it's not going to have a massive impact. So your battery will just keep on draining. So typically in that scenario, you've just got to limit what you do. So that's typically if you see it going down to, I've only got 1 bar of battery life left. Well, in that case, now I might need to think about not making as many calls. But you might say, what about receiving calls? Well, they will still cause the same amount of battery because you're still transmitting the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned satellite there, but realistically, your phone's not really going to be using satellite unless it happens to have access to an NTN, which is, at this moment in time, fairly unlikely.
So it's just on how much you've got open on your phone, which
Yeah, well,
Morgan would
there's
struggle
been-
with, wouldn't you, Morgan?
there's-
With the amount of tabs that you have open on.
Oh God! If
In life.
anybody out there, this is a call out to the abyss. If anybody else is like me, a kindred spirit with your multi-browser tabs, please get in touch.
There is basic stuff you can do, like switch Wi-Fi off, switch Bluetooth off if you don't need it,
True.
turn your screen brightness to absolute minimum.
But it is a precious commodity when you're traveling, isn't it?
It is.
Maintaining your battery life, and that's why in planes and things they've got all these fancy things now. You can plug your phone in. You've got all your creature comforts. Even not that this is a segue into the next question. Even Wi-Fi on planes here. So how is that even possible? Where does the Wi-Fi on a plane that's flying over the Atlantic come from?
Certainly, the Wi-Fi, you got to remember, is local to the aircraft. So you're not connecting to a Wi-Fi on the ground. It's a localized Wi-Fi network. So the question is more, how do you get all that traffic that's kind of being passed on the Wi-Fi network to and from the aeroplane? Mm-hmm. And the answer, Phil?
Thanks for that one, Gavin. The answer is different options. There's been quite a big push to get connectivity on planes, and the main way of doing it historically was to put in satellite receivers. So just like you've got your satellite phones on the ground, you could put a satellite dish on the top of the plane. And the idea is it'll go up to the satellite, down to what's called an earth station, connect to the internet, and you get all your Wi-Fi internet connectivity. So what we're doing is replacing, a bit like in your home where you've got your broadband connection into the internet service provider, we're just replacing that with a satellite link into the internet service provider. So effectively, it's a bit like your home is now the plane.
Do you, I think we should vote, would you have Wi-Fi on a plane or not? I say no. I like not having Wi-Fi on a plane. It gives me a chance to
There'll be a lot of people disagreeing.
The thing is, with your Wi-Fi, you people listening will no doubt have experienced Wi-Fi on a plane, and you know that it's not like your home Wi-Fi. You can do basic things like exchange WhatsApp messages and things like that, but you ain't going to be watching Netflix in 4K on a plane Wi-Fi. So
Not yet.
It's fairly limited. Well, and it's not Wi-Fi that's the limitation, remember. It is the satellite backhaul. That's the bottleneck that causes the problems.
Do you want Wi-Fi on a plane, Gavin?
I was trying to give you a politician's answer there.
I know, I just want to know, hands up, who would like Wi-Fi on a
We're
plane?
on podcast, don't put your hands up.
We're going to reveal it at the end. They're going to wait until they find out.
Personally, I'd prefer to just kick back and watch a movie.
Oh, just
Agree.
like your normal life.
Yeah, if only.
Bill?
Yeah, I don't want Wi-Fi on the plane.
Okay.
No.
I mean, it's a very
Morgan?
moot point because it's already deployed everywhere, so clearly there's a...
But you've got to remember, a lot of
consumer market
business
that needs
people,
it.
you can waste a lot of hours travelling, and therefore
Yeah.
there is the scenario where rather than say, let's do the work when you get home, you can do the work whilst you're travelling home, in which case you can switch off when you get home. So it is a bit of a work-life balance thing for Wi-Fi.
Yes, indeed. I don't understand why, and this is very naive of me, but I'm just going to throw it out there. So Phil and Gav, you guys pick it up how you may. Why we can't just take like a multi-layered approach to these non-terrestrial networks by using more drones and then having the drones connect to the satellites and then using the terrestrial networks have a greater reach through the drones.
Drones, at the end of the day, are based on battery life. So if you imagine
Can they not be solar powered?
Not really for the amount of energy that they're going to have to use.
Do I need to patent this idea, Phil, as I'm saying
no,
it?
you don't bother.
No, not
Airbus
yet.
might have got that.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what I was going to say is a bit like your phone is draining battery. So imagine the drone. It's the other end. It's got this similar drain. It's drained, but if it's looking after 10 people, that's 10 times as much energy. If that makes sense.
It depends on the scale of coverage. If you, in your mind you're thinking of a small drone covering a small area, then battery is going to be the issue. But that is available in kind of an emergency disaster type scenario. But there's other scenarios where there's very large drones that, you know, are solar powered and can provide coverage for quite a long time, but that coverage isn't going to be 4K Netflix again. So
yeah, it's
there's
a balance.
trade-off.
Yeah, it's a balance of the number of users, the services, and the performance that we're going to get. Definitely. So yeah, good idea, but
Not quite.
Not quite.
That's okay.
Okay, you probably won't have noticed this, but we've just actually had an edit point in the session, despite doing a live recording. Somebody's just walked into our recording room, so apologies for that. Whilst we weren't actually doing the recording, Phil talked about Morgan droning on about drones, which is an absolute classic, but quickly moving on, we'll push back to you guys. Any more questions on the subject of travel?
Well, I think we were talking to Rosie because everything is so expensive right now. And if we couldn't find a holiday abroad, talking about a staycation.
Would cry, Morgan.
Well, we would cry, but then we would look at somewhere maybe in the UK. That would be last-ditch effort. But if we did, I think that the question we had was, when I am out and about in my country on my presumed home network, my signal is not very good, but I could look over at Rosie's phone and she's got better signal. Why could my phone not just switch to her phone's network if hers is better?
My wife often asks me this question because her provider isn't great, not mentioning any names.
Do you have two different providers?
Yeah, I didn't think that was unusual.
No. When you're married, everything becomes one, doesn't it? Same provider, same
I bet you've
bank
got the
account.
better one though, Gavin, haven't you?
I
bet he
do
does.
actually,
Yeah.
but that's
That's not
probably
fair.
that's not because I've got some kind of insider knowledge or anything like that.
No.
Right, so we're talking about something called national roaming, and a lot of people in the UK aren't aware that this is really a thing, but it is a thing. So national roaming does indeed allow you to use the services of a different operator in the same country. So every operator is identified by what's called a PLMN ID, a public land mobile
Had to
network
get an
ID.
acronym in. Can't
Yes,
go
of
through
course
one
I did.
podcast without an acronym.
Yes. And your phone is looking for a particular PLMN ID. In the UK, we don't have national roaming. We did have previously. We allowed it between a couple of operators, but it was more of a network coverage thing. But generally speaking, we don't have national roaming in the UK. Our government, as it is at the moment, basically disallowed it for various reasons. So in the UK, it ain't happening until the government says it's allowed to happen, basically. But the concept is the same as international roaming. You know, I think generally on a technical level, it's going to operate in a very similar way.
Is there somewhere that we can go and look to see where the best coverage is in certain areas?
Oh,
Is there
yes.
something that is published like that?
Yeah, there's lots of resources online that give you that. There's independent ones which I'd recommend using, but the operators tend to give you coverages.
Yeah, most operators, if you go to their website, will have their coverage map and you'll select 4G, 5G, and it will reasonably give you a decent level of sort of signal level you should assume on that technology in that area. So you can say, oh yeah, there's my house. I'm in a sort of dead spot, or oh yes, I can see I'm going to get 5 bars on my phone.
It's quite interesting actually, because there's quite a lot of independent, what are called crowdsourced information supplies now. So people voluntarily put an app on their phone and allow the phone to collect data on the phone's coverage wherever that phone happens to move to. And, you know, it is available for public consumption, but these companies also make money from the service providers because the service providers are interested in this crowdsourced data that is made available to them. And it's now, for a lot of service providers, a key input into the service providers' KPIs in terms of network coverage.
Surely they can track all that anyway, even without our permission.
Well, yeah, they do drive testing, so they do their internal stuff, but even with drive testing, it's quite an expense when you've basically got thousands of people that are voluntarily doing the job for you, so it's quite attractive for the operator.
And the other thing is when looking at it from a drive testing perspective, you're only drive testing one type of phone, doing one service like voice or typically voice or possibly some data, whereas if you think about the crowdsourced model, it's different makes, different models, different use cases of what people are doing. You get slightly different sort of scenarios in there. And they're going to places where you might not drive test, or it might not be cost effective to drive test, send somebody into that area, just because of maybe the low population or the scenario.
And speaking about roaming and coverage, I came across a news article. Actually, Stuart, you showed it to me. Stuart, he's recording the podcast over here. He's our digital media manager. And it was about whether or not the UK is going to reach its quota for sort of the target it's set for 4G coverage. And I don't know if you had any input on that.
That's, all operators are under the control of Ofcom in terms of the frequency that is given to them, the license spectrum that's given to them, and they have obligations that they must fulfill. And one of them is coverage to a certain percentage of the population. So if that is not going to be fulfilled, then quite significant fines can be involved. And operators, they do use different techniques to assist, so they share RAN components and things like that to make the deployment of a radio network cheaper. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me because it's very challenging.
Yeah, it also depends on the operator, and obviously Ofcom's in the UK, different countries have their different regulators. So it depends on how that radio spectrum that they've been assigned or bought through auctions, etc. What limitations came with that. And it might be a case of they've just said, here, do it and do what you will. Or they might have said, you've got to do this. So it does depend on which country you're in.
And the thing is, the operator, they might have access to low-band spectrum, which means that the radio signal has got really good coverage, it propagates really far. But typically, you're not going to get a particularly big channel size. So if you're at the edge of that radio coverage, you can say, yes, I've got 4G coverage, but the data throughput may be comparable to 3G. So it depends on what kind of targets that the regulator will set. It's not just about coverage. It's got to be an acceptable level of service as well.
Yeah, there's two, isn't there? There's coverage, as in the KPI to do with the percentage of population, which is mainly covering the cities, to be honest. If you do cities and towns, you're probably getting to the 90% figure. It's the ones where you want to do percentage of coverage, and that might be to do with some form of emergency service network deployment, where you need to have coverage everywhere for that service. They're a bit more challenging.
So, unless there's any further questions?
I have a question, because it's travel related.
Okay.
Favourite holiday destination?
That's a good one.
Oh.
You both have
Singapore.
been everywhere.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah, I do love Singapore. Yeah,
that's Singapore for me.
but I
Morgan?
think for me, honestly, the States. I love trips to the States.
What about you?
Well, I
Morgan?
love the States, but I'm biased because I'm American.
So England, staycation then?
Yeah,
Oh,
probably not.
thanks.
No, I did love Geneva.
Yes.
And what about
beautiful
you,
place.
Yeah, Rosie.
I'd say the south of France for me.
Lovely.
You?
Stuart,
We?
UK. Stuart shrugs and says the UK.
Proud English.
Okay, right, so we'll wrap it up for this session. Hope you enjoyed session number 4, the travel blog. Session number 5 will be the penultimate session for Mpirical Podcast Series 1. Just trying to draw up a bit of excitement there and anticipation, like a cliffhanger at the end of... I don't know what popular series. Anyway, I'm waffling on. I hope you enjoyed the session. We'll talk to you again in podcast number 5, where we'll be focusing on private wireless networks.